Okay, hello again. The last session, of course, divided into two videos. I see now lasted a bit longer than I had originally intended, and it included a lot more detail than I thought it would. And the fault there is mine, because once I start to talk about Tito and Yugoslavia, that being a topic that I've worked on for many years, it very quickly spirals out of control, and I just have more and more to say and get more sort of animated about this topic. So I apologize for that. And I will try to keep this one a little bit briefer to make up for your time. But what I would say is that if the last session was too complicated, then you can contact me, or we can discuss it during the Moodle, the team session in the coming weeks, and I can recommend some very good books on this topic that explain the various complexities of Tito's life. I can even recommend some very good biographies of Tito, and it is an incredible life. So there is, it makes for quite good reading. Anyway, I'm going off again, so I'm shutting up about him now. And in this session, I want to talk a little bit about Albania. So we're staying in the Balkan region, and we're looking at another Balkan country that is very different from Yugoslavia, but at the same time also I think is interesting because it also ultimately treads a separate path from the rest of the bloc, just as we've seen how Yugoslavia broke away unwittingly from the Eastern Bloc at the end of the Second World War in 1948, and we'll see later on how it pursued its own path. The same thing happened in communist Albania. It became ultimately estranged from the Eastern Bloc and went off in a very strange direction. So I want to talk about that. I must admit at the outset, I have a kind of an affection for Albania. I'm quite evangelical about this country. It's very beautiful, very small. Again, a little bit like Bosnia, has this Ottoman era and medieval era sort of period detail. The natural beauty of the country has this great coastline, this great Riviera. Also mountainous in the north of the country if you're interested in hiking and this kind of thing. It's unspoiled to this day by tourism. Nobody dreams of going to Albania, and as a result of this, it's very cheap. And the people there are extremely curious and welcoming and friendly, and it's very safe to travel through this country. So I always sort of feel good about Albania. But its history is also a very interesting one. It's often neglected because it's a small country. The Albanian language is quite a difficult one to master. I don't know it. I must say I don't know a single word of Albanian. So it's often neglected outside of its own borders. But nevertheless, the story is a very strange one, a very interesting one, and I think it shows us how the struggle of a small state to achieve a modicum of independence when it is surrounded by very hungry and very sort of avaricious neighbors can lead a country into a very strange corner, a very strange position in international affairs. Now, Albania is relatively sort of regular now. I mean, it's heading towards European integration. It's a member of NATO. It's not closed off as it has once been, but under communism, it certainly was for a very long period of time. A little bit like the way North Korea is in the 21st century. Now, the dominant figure in today's discussion is this man here in slide number 1 on the left-hand side. This is Enver Hoxha, and Hoxha would come to play a corresponding role in Albania as Tito did in Yugoslavia. A strongman dictator who arrives as a guerrilla leader in a successful revolution during the Second World War and will remain in power right up until his death. Hoxha dies, in fact, in 1985. Okay, so let's begin by looking at Albania. As I say, and this is in slide number 2, a small country, also part of the Balkans, also under Ottoman rule for very many centuries. And this period of Ottoman rule resulted in a quite complicated ethnic breakdown, an ethnic sort of mix. Within Albania, the majority of the population are 70% Muslim, 20% are Orthodox Christian, 10% are Catholic Christian, mainly in the north of the country. And there are also various sort of traditional patriarchal tribal divisions. The most important one is between the Gegs, who are in the north of the country, the Geg tribe, and the Tosk tribe, which are in the south of the country. Now, again, the various reasons for this. I mean, the 70% Muslim, for example, part of the population is as a result of the Ottoman period and mass kind of conversions, with all of sort of the mysteries and the reasons we don't understand exactly why and how that happened. But nevertheless, there's a very large Muslim presence, and again, the architecture and this sort of the feel and the look of Albania looks like a former Ottoman province. A lot of madrasas, a lot of Ottoman era bridges, a lot of mosques, of course, this kind of thing. Now, all of these, interestingly enough, are not a hugely important issue. If we turn to slide number 3, the sort of the key figure of the Albanian national awakening in the 19th century, which in Albanian is known as the Rinja, was a man called Pashko Vasa. And Vasa would be somebody like, somebody, one of the great 19th century national awakeners in Ireland. I can't think of a single one at the moment. Somebody like Parnell or like Yeats or one of those great figures. And Pashko Vasa very famously laid out a concept that he called Albanianism. And this was essentially the national identity, the communal identity of the Albanian people was much more powerful than all of these tribal and religious differences. Albanians were Albania. The religion of the Albanians was Albanianism. And this principle that Albanians first and foremost Albanians, and secondly, based on their language, their shared history, all of these sorts of things, and only secondarily are they Muslims, Catholics, Gegs, Tosks. This generally held in the 19th and the 20th century. There were very stark tribal divisions within the country. It was based on a traditional values, but nevertheless, we're talking about a very small country, a country of less than 2 million people, who overridingly sort of think of themselves as linked, no matter where they are in the country, through their Albanian nationality. So quite fascinating and quite different from, say, Ireland, where to be Protestant Irish or to be Catholic Irish is a very big difference, or indeed to be, in Yugoslavia, to be a Catholic Croat or a Orthodox Serb, or a Catholic Bosnian or an Orthodox Bosnian means a world of difference. It means a very important and very deep sort of difference between identity. In Albania, this was not true. Vasa's notional Albanian communal identity was a very powerful thing. Now, the great Albanian, like I said, Albania up until the very very late in the day, and even incredibly in the 21st century, Albania was essentially a pre-modern society, being in the mountains, being separated from the imperial metropole in Istanbul, the Ottoman center of imperial power, meant that Albanian traditional society was largely sort of unbothered and untouched by sort of modernization, by secularization, by these sorts of things. So Albanian society, up until a very late stage, was still extremely traditional and was still governed, not by contemporary rule of law, not by political institutions like a parliament or like a government, but by ancient tribal codes. And I can't go through all of these. I mean, they're laid out in sort of catechisms and in sort of folk tribal sort of ethnographic folk custom. There's an entire sort of there's an entire kind of library of these things. But I can just give you a few examples. So one example would be the blood vendetta. Traditionally in Albanian society, what the blood vendetta meant was that if somebody commits a crime, usually a murder, against somebody else, the retribution for this is that person can go and murder the person who murdered them. But that also means that the blood vendetta bounces back, and that this other person who just committed this murder in retribution can also be murdered, and then also it can go on and back and forth. And in fact, some of these blood vendettas would go on for decades. Two families could be in blood, it was called, with one another, could be in the middle of this vendetta for very long periods of time. And it was an incredibly sort of chaotic and bloodthirsty, bloodthirsty sort of system. The vendetta was laid out. The rules of the vendetta were very carefully coded. The person who was in blood had a month of grace to get his affairs in order. If he was in his house, he could not be killed. If he was in the presence of a female member of his family, he could not be subject to the vendetta. At times, it meant the people would just simply sort of stay in their homes for sort of years and years until the blood vendetta blew over. A couple of other things, and I don't want to go into too much detail. The Besa was known as the blood, like an oath that you would swear to somebody else that was simply unbreakable. If I give somebody my Besa, it means that my life now is sort of devoted to fulfilling this code. If I promise somebody that I will protect them, if I promise somebody that I will pay them, if I promise somebody that I will work for them, that I will marry into their family, that the Besa is like an unbreakable bond. And there's a very beautiful folk story in Albanian custom, which is called the story of the Ghost Rider, or Dorantine, which tells the story of a woman who has 12 sons and one daughter. And the daughter is married off, is about to get married, and the mother is sort of, tearful and upset. And she says, well, look, now my daughter will leave, all my sons will leave, I'll be completely on my own. And the youngest son says, no, it won't happen. Whatever happens, I'll ensure that your daughter comes back to you, or that you have one of your children with you until your dying days. I give you my Besa, mother, that I will do this. The youngest girl, Dorantine, gets married, leaves the home. The 12 brothers are called up by the Ottoman army into a war to fight for them. All 12 of them are killed. And the mother, in her mourning and her grief, cries out and says, the youngest son, you've broken the Besa. You've betrayed your sacred oath to me. You promised that I wouldn't be alone, and now I am. And on hearing this lamentation, the youngest son, dead on the battlefield, rises back into this sort of, like a revenant, comes back to life, gets on his horse, rides all day and all night to arrive at the village where his sister, who is married, now lives, takes her up in the middle of the night, puts her on the back of this kind of demonic horse, and travels all the way back to his mother's house to sort of bring the daughter back to her mother and to fulfill his Besa. The story sort of, obviously fictional, and obviously, and when it's told in a traditional Albanian setting, it's told much better than the way that I've just told it. But nevertheless, this is an example of how important these tribal customs are within Albania, things like the Besa and things like these sorts of things. The last thing, and I'll move on very quickly, is the notion of the sworn virgin, another tribal custom which is still relevant and still active in 21st century Albania. This is the story of if in a household There are no male members of the household. The female member can relinquish her gender, can relinquish her femininity and become essentially a man. Not in the sense that she would undergo any kind of transition, but nevertheless that she will live as a man with all of the rights, all of the entitlements, all of the respect that a man gets in traditional patriarchal society. She will dress like a man, she will be treated like a man, she can fight in wars like a man, she becomes what is known as a sworn virgin. A very good Italian documentary maker made a film about this. Went up into the mountains of northern Albania and found some of these sworn virgins, and it's an anthropological phenomenon that has become recently quite of interest to our Western observers, because we are now learning more about gender, and we're learning that it's not binary, and we're learning that people can transition, and we become interested in the story of the sworn virgins because we could see in an extremely patriarchal and tribal society how this phenomenon also exists. I mention those only because I want to sort of elaborate, and I want you to understand that there won't be an exam, there won't be a test on Albanian tribal customs. Although if you take an interest in them, then that would be wonderful, and you'd be very welcome to do that. There is an extremely good Albanian author. This is in slide number 5. A man called Ismail Kadare, who has written extensively about these kinds of things. He's written many novels about Albanian society. He's written about the Blood Vendetta. He's written about the Ghost Rider. He's written about all oral poetry, and I highly recommend you go out and seek his books. He's written about the communist period. He's written about all kinds of things, and he's a great he's a great essayist. He's a great he has great accounts of Albanian society. He comes from a beautiful town, which I put a picture up of, called Gjirokastër. It's in the south of Albania. It's a UNESCO town. It's an extremely beautiful 19th century Ottoman town. I've never seen anything like this before. One of the most beautiful places that I've ever been to. Okay, so Albanians had, as a national group, an ethnic group, been a small group, and they had actually been in quite a good position within the Ottoman setup. In the Ottoman Empire, Albanians were amongst the most important soldiers, political figures in Istanbul had very often been, the ministers, the viziers, had very often been of Albanian background. So the Albanians, despite being a small group, were very well sort of adapted to the Ottoman imperial system. And as a result of this, their decolonization did not arrive until very late, unlike the Serbs, unlike the Montenegrins, unlike the Bulgarians who sort of decolonized in the 19th century. Albania did not become an independent state until 1912. Then there was the war, and then it re-emerged in the interwar period. Now, it was still extremely backward, and the interwar period was dominated by this figure here in slide number 6, a man called Ahmed Zogu, who was a tribal leader from the north of the country, who managed to sort of come out of the mountains and impose a certain kind of unity and a certain kind of national consolidation upon the Albanian people. He announced that he was the king of the Albanians, renamed himself King Zog, and ruled the country from the end of the 1920s until the 1930s. And once again, he did so in a very dictatorial fashion. He was a bit like Karađorđević. He was a bit like one of these figures. He aspired to bring unity to the people, to his people, but he did so by abandoning democracy. Now, in the Second World War, Albania was occupied by the Germans, by the Italians, but also incredibly by the Greeks. The southern parts of the border with Greeks, parts called Epirus, were also briefly occupied by the Greeks. So once again, Albania lost its independence. And just like in Yugoslavia, during the Second World War, Albania descended into a civil war. There were supporters of Zog, there were supporters of other nationalist groups. All of these were fighting each other, but also fighting the occupier. In Albania, the Italians were particularly despised because, essentially Albania was seen by many Italians, including, of course, Mussolini, to be part of the Italian Empire. The Germans were not quite so despised because Germany was a very long way away, and the Germans simply didn't care about Albania. It was just some tiny, rocky, unrewarding, poverty-stricken Balkan kingdom, Balkan territory, Balkan land, which was very backward, and which was of minimal interest to the Germans. Now, just like in Yugoslavia, there was a communist movement, and it was headed by these men in slide number 7, Enver Hoxha and Mehmet Shehu. Now, Enver Hoxha had been a student, a university student in the 1920s. He had taken one of King Zog's scholarships and he had studied in France, where was it? Marseille, I think, but I might be wrong about that. But anyway, he studied at a French university. I'm not sure if it's Marseille. Anyway, not Paris, but somewhere in France. And in France, he had fallen under the influence of communists, and he had become a communist. And he had come back to Albania in the 1930s, and he had attempted to organize a communist movement. Now, the communist movement was extremely small, so paltry in Albania in the interwar period that it was not even worthy of membership of the Communist International, the Comintern, the Soviet organized and Soviet dominated network of loyal international communist parties. Now, something changed in the Second World War. Just like in Yugoslavia, Hoxha and the leading communists organized a guerrilla warfare, organized a national resistance, a guerrilla insurgency against the occupiers and against the collaborators. And as the war went on, Hoxha's forces ultimately emerged as the successful party, just as they had done in Yugoslavia. Now, it was an incredible transformation at the beginning of the war, which began in Albania in 1939. The Communist Party had only a few dozen members. By the end of the war, it had become a national movement, a mass movement. It had completely transformed. Now, this was partially because of the successes. Just like in the case of Yugoslavia, Hoxha also spoke about unity. He understood, for example, the ideology of Pasa, of Vasa, of Albanian, the religion of Albania is Albanianism. He was able to bring together the separate tribes, the separate groups under this kind of communist umbrella. This was one reason, but there nevertheless had been a remarkable transformation in the Albanian Communist Party. Now we'll see under Hoxha's rule in the Cold War. Hoxha always claimed that this was just some alchemy, that all of a sudden, his support, his appeal, the appeal of communism as a movement, had completely transformed the Albanian Communist Party into a mass movement and into a successful guerrilla insurgency. And he would claim, that his top generals were simply military geniuses, and the man who was closest to him until he had him killed in the 70s was a man called Mehmet Shehu, and he was the leader, one of the key generals of the Albanian partisan army. Now, the reality was quite different. What had actually happened during the Second World War was that Tito had sent advisors, military advisors, political advisors into Albania to meet with Shehu, to meet with Hoxha, and to coordinate the Albanian communist movement, to sort of explain how they could recruit, explain how they could explain that they needed political education, political commissars to go into the villages, to persuade Albanians to follow this movement. Because of we'll see why in a minute, but because of various reasons, Hoxha always kept that quiet. But in fact, the transformation owed in a large part to the Yugoslavs and the Yugoslav communists and Tito, not unlike the Italians, the Greeks, and success, and or whoever or the Ottomans even, also had sort of territorial designs. They were not completely benign. They were not, they were interfering also in Albanian affairs, and as I mentioned in the last session, ultimately Tito's hope and Tito's goal was that Albania would become swallowed up by Yugoslavia, that it would become again a part of the Yugoslav space, the Yugoslav territory, and this for Tito would be the easiest solution to the fact that he had a large number of Albanians already in the country, and this was the best way to solve territorial disputes and expand his control, expand his coastline, expand his resources, and all of these sorts of things. Very quickly, as an aside, that is a picture that I took in Tirana. That's Albanian. That's Hoxha's home. Hoxha lived there. It's actually not bad by the standard. I've never been inside. There's talk about you can't get in; it's not open. But there is talk about turning this into a museum. But that's a very controversial issue because the memory of communism in present day Albania is quite a painful one. But nevertheless, this is where Hoxha lived throughout the Cold War. And indeed, he never went abroad from the 1960s onwards. We'll see why in a minute. And as he got older and older, basically he just stayed within this house in Tirana, and he just wrote and wrote and wrote. And the stuff that he wrote gets increasingly sort of unhinged. He wrote volumes about Tito, about Stalin, about Khrushchev, about Shehu, about Zog, about everything, history, literature, politics, and all of this stuff became increasingly sort of weird, and Hoxha himself became a very sort of detached and very kind of, very strange in his last years. One other thing about this house is that there is a cafe now on the ground, just in front of it. And I sat there when I was in Tirana, and this even by Balkan standards, this was the most criminal cafe that I've ever seen. And I mean it's like this is guys with the guns on the guns in their pockets, shell suits, gold chains, silicone enhanced girlfriends, sports cars. It's kind of it's me this kind of academic sitting there for a few minutes drinking getting ripped off paying for coffee and thinking about Enver Hoxha. So it's quite a strange thing. So Hoxha emerged successfully. Now Hoxha also is a very lucky figure. Hoxha's head was on the block at the end of the Second World War, despite winning the Albanian Civil War, and despite his movement, of which he was the leader, emerging as the winner in this civil war. Nevertheless, it seemed, until the split with Yugoslavia, it seemed that Stalin was amenable to the idea, was favorable to the idea that Albania would become part of an expanded Yugoslavia. And at one of these meetings that Gilas describes in Conversations with Stalin, so the book that I talked about in the last session, Gilas talks about how at one of these midnight banquets, drunken banquets in the Kremlin, Stalin picks up a piece of bread, slavers caviar on top of it, and says to Gilas, "This is Albania," puts it in his mouth and says, "And you may swallow Albania." And Gilas, not really knowing what to think about this, reported back to Tito and said, "Look, we were all drinking a lot. It was all getting a bit rowdy, but nevertheless, Stalin seems to be favorable to our plans of incorporating Albania into an expanded Yugoslav state." Now, what this would have meant, of course, is that Hoxha would have been deposed. Hoxha was desperate to keep the independence of Albania, believed that this is what they had fought for during the Second World War, wanted to make sure that Albania remained an independent state, had its own foreign policy, had its own domestic foreign policy. So he was completely opposed to this Yugoslav takeover. Now, if it had happened, there's no doubt the Hoxha would have been arrested, Hoxha would have been killed, and he would have been replaced with somebody who was much more favourable to the Yugoslav line. And Hoxha even had somebody in mind. Tito even had somebody in mind. It was this man in slide number 8, a man called Koci Joja. Now, I apologise about the confusion. I can't help it. Unfortunately, the two key figures in this saga are Hoxha and Joja, and it doesn't make it easy, and I know. But basically, Hoxha is opposed to the Yugoslav line, has a pro-Albanian independent line. Joja is very much, much more a man who will sort of work with the Yugoslavs and who will subordinate Albania to Yugoslav interests. So it's very clear that the Yugoslav plan was to remove Hoxha, was to have him killed or imprisoned at the very least, and to replace him with Joja, and this would be the first move towards incorporating Albania into Yugoslavia. Now, it never happened, of course, because as we now know, in 1948, Yugoslavia broke with the Soviet Union. And what that meant was that all of these grand schemes that Tito had been harboring vis-a-vis Albania were now, they came to nothing. That also meant that by the skin of his teeth, Hoxha would survive and would be able to consolidate his rule within Albania. So after the break, I mentioned very briefly that Stalin used this post-break period to sort of remove any figure that he deemed possibly independent-minded, possibly opposed to him throughout the Eastern Bloc. So all of those communists that he couldn't 100% rely on, he accused them of being Titoists and had them put on trial, show trials, imprisoned, but in most cases executed. Hoxha did exactly the same thing in Albania, removed people like Joja, put him on trial, found him guilty, executed him, removed anyone from the Albanian Communist Party that he believed would be potentially an opponent to him. And he behaved with incredible ruthlessness at this time. There was a communist, a female communist, I think her name is Lili Berisha, but I might be wrong about that, who was also accused of Titoism, was also accused of being close to the Yugoslavs. She was put on trial, she was executed, despite being 6 months pregnant. This is how unforgiving Hoxha was towards anyone who could potentially stand in his way. He was so kind of brutal in these trials and in this sort of consolidation of power and arrests and imprisonments and executions, that even the Soviet Union were horrified about what they were doing. One quote, I can't remember who it's from, possibly Khrushchev, is that these Albanians were worse than beasts, the bestial way that they were inflicting this sort of, these reprisals and this consolidation and this liquidation of enemies was an incredibly brutal period. Now, it worked. Hoxha would manage to secure his rule within the country. Getting rid of Joja, getting rid of the pro-Yugoslav forces, ensuring that he would become the leading figure in Albanian communism, in Albanian politics, just as Tito had done in Yugoslavia. But what's really remarkable, I think, about Hoxha is that he never ever de-Stalinized the country. In order to keep his own position, in order to keep his own place at the head of the table, he resisted any calls to reform, to change the politics, to sort of rehabilitate people that he may have killed who had not been guilty, who had been innocent people. We'll see in a couple of weeks' time that in the 1950s, when Stalin dies, in all of the Eastern Bloc countries, there's a realignment of politics, that the Stalinist leaders who have been in charge since the end of the 1940s are now, sort of removed, or they're set to one side, and a new sort of liberal course is charted. So in places like Hungary, in places like Poland, we will talk more about that in the future. But for the time being, none of this happens in Albania. Once Hoxha has his grip on power, he does not let it go up until the very bitter end in 1985. Now, it becomes very ridiculous, it must be said. In order to keep on with power, Hoxha must always claim that all of the decisions that he's made are the correct ones. That he never put a foot wrong, that all of his, all the people that he killed deserved to be killed, the politics that he adhered to were the right politics. It means that when Khrushchev came into power in the 1950s in the Soviet Union and called for de-Stalinization, Hoxha resisted this, claimed that Khrushchev was deviating from Stalin's path. When Brezhnev came into power, he did the same thing. It meant that eventually, if we switch to slide number 10, it eventually, because Khrushchev, as we'll see, tried to get close again to Yugoslavia, tried to sort of get a rapprochement with Tito. It meant that time and time again, Hoxha had to sort of resist these new revisionist lines, this Khrushchevite line, this Brezhnev line. Up until his dying days, he claimed that he was the last loyal subject of Stalin, claimed that he was very good friends with Stalin, claims that everything else that was happening in the rest of the bloc was the wrong moves. Eventually became estranged from the Soviet Union. So Albania becomes a very isolated country, and it does so because Hoxha wants to sort of remain in power and remain the key figure. It creates some very strange things. For example, if we go to slide number 11, Mehmet Shehu, who had been with Hoxha right from the very beginning in the Second World War, eventually was purged from the party at the beginning of the 1980s. And Hoxha claimed, ridiculously, that Shehu, since that time, for the last 4 decades, had been an agent of the enemy, had been an imperialist traitor. It simply just doesn't, it just beggars belief. His right-hand man, who had been with him, since the Second World War, all through everything that had happened in communist Albania, right up until the beginning of the 1980s, all that time had been a traitor, all that time had been a double agent. It was simply false, of course, and no one could believe such a thing. But nevertheless, these are the bizarre sort of moves that Hoxha needed to make, rather than admit that the line that he was towing was wrong. He had to keep sort of getting rid of people near him, keep moving in the straight direction, keep saying that he was with the original, this original plan. He was mortally sort of terrified of being invaded. If we switch to slide number 12, Albania to this day is pockmarked with bunkers. School children were learning guerrilla warfare. The entire country had this elaborate system based on the war of the Second World War, that if they were invaded by Italy, by Yugoslavia, by the Soviet Union, maybe by China, then they would protect themselves by setting up these bunkers across the country. They're very ugly. They're everywhere. They're usually used as sort of outhouses for cows, or teenagers go in there and smoke pot sometimes, or do whatever teenagers do. But they're all everywhere across the country. So an increasingly isolated line, and all because Hoxha wanted to keep power, wanted to stay in power, didn't want to revise the position. Now, in Hoxha's defense, not that I would be a huge fan of his, but from his point of view, he looked at this tiny country, which since its birth in 1912 had been a playground for bigger powers. Had been dismembered by the had been occupied by the Italians, the Germans, had been coveted by the Yugoslavs, had been invaded by Greece. There was a great sense that this country, that its independence could be lost and the Albanian people would suffer because of that. Hoxha, this I think was first and foremost in Hoxha's mind, to preserve the independence of the country. But in order to do this, he had to make some very strange departures. He had to resist Tito, he had to resist Khrushchev, he had to go towards China in the 1960s and the 1970s. This was a very delicate balancing act, which led to Albania becoming increasingly isolated, an increasingly paranoid country, very much like North Korea in the 21st century. Nobody knew really what was happening inside Albania. Nobody could visit there. Very cut off from the rest of the world, very small, very isolated, but nevertheless maintaining its independence. This is sort of, if Hoxha has achievements, then this, I suppose, is one of them. Again, Kadare writes very beautifully about this, and his books and his novels depict this sense of paranoia and this sense of isolation. One of the best books is a book called The Successor, which is based on the psychodrama between Shehu and Hoxha, and tells the story about how Shehu, who seemed to be the successor of Hoxha, dramatically falls at the beginning of the 1980s. All the names were changed, of course. He couldn't write about them directly, but nevertheless, this is a very interesting metaphorical discussion of power in Albania. Okay, to wrap up, the final slide, number 13. Hoxha's Albania, it did achieve certain things at a great cost. Albania, when the communists came to power, very backward, still tribal, still no electrification, none of this. Hoxha really did achieve a lot of modernization within the country, built roads, electrified, built schools, ended the blood vendetta, ended those tribal customs which were so deleterious and so destructive. The communist program, of course, was a modernizing program. We'll talk more about that in our next sessions when we talk about building socialism in the 1950s and the 1960s. But the communists wanted to create modern industrial societies, educated people, people who could read books, people who could go to the theatre, people who could play sports, all of these sorts of things. And Hoxha was committed that the Albania under communist rule would achieve those things. To a certain extent, he emancipated women as well. He broke down those atavistic tribal customs, got women into the workplace, got women in education, got women rights in marriage. And achieved these sorts of things as well. Again, they came at a terrible price, but comparing to what Albania had been in the interwar period and under Zog, I don't say that it was freer or fairer or less horrifying under Hoxha, but he did work very hard to sort of modernize and to secularize and to sort of to sort of open up the workplace to women and this kind of thing. He also launched an atheism campaign, and the atheism campaign was to sort of achieve Vasa's goal of Albanianism, to sort of get rid of the Orthodox Church, to get rid of the Islamic Church. Hoxha was particularly worried about the Catholic minority. He believed that they had been very close to Italian fascists during the Second World War, so he waged a very brutal campaign against the Catholic Church, knocked down their churches, arrested priests. Eventually, in the 1960s, he declared that Albania was the world's first atheist country. This was one of his apparent great achievements. Okay, I'm going to end there, but just to say that I wanted to talk a little bit about Albania, first of all, because I didn't want to neglect it. I think it's a small but interesting case study of what the communists did, what they achieved, but also how a small country under communism can become very isolated, under somebody like Hoxha, because it's attempting to sort of chart this independent line. Okay, I think we'll end this one here.